Welcome to the Starting Point podcast. My name is Loretta Depka Zerbo, and I'm here with two honored guests to talk about intimacy and long-term relationships. Now, this is the second part of a three-part series, and we look forward to having another good conversation. With me today, Anna Marie Hrivnak. Anna Marie is a practitioner focusing on the integration of body, mind, and spirit. She works with individuals in private and group sessions. Her work fosters a foundation for peace and tranquility for the mind, strength in the physical body, and hope and courage for the wounded spirits. Her sessions usually focus on the recovery process in a way that promotes a balance of emotional honesty and responsibility, providing clients with a framework for a healthier lifestyle. We also have Ken Goldberg with us today. Ken is a clinical psychologist with 46 years of professional experience. He focuses on health instead of pathology, using using psychoeducational techniques to help his clients chart meaningful and satisfying lives. Ken, I'm not quite sure why you have this in your bio, but it says Ken is a senior citizen who is strongly committed to helping people enjoy the benefits of senior intimacy in their advancing years. So, without further ado, welcome both of you.
Thank you.
And let's jump in there.
Mm-hmm.
So, we talked in the previous podcast about the stressors, and we talked about all 5 of them. So, what we decided was one of the least talked about, at least in our community, is sex as a long-term relationship challenge. So, let's begin with, can external stressors such as job security, financing, demanding schedules, travel expectations, be detrimental to sex in long-term relationships? And Ken, why don't you start with that one?
Well, I think life is stressful, and you've raised a number of areas of common stress. And for everybody, the configuration of those problems differs. For some, one area is more stressful than the other, but it's just part of life that we go through these things. And I don't know that I'd say that they are detrimental to one's sexual relationship. I think people make a mistake if they allow those life events to interfere with their sexual relationship. People tend to have an idea about what sex is, and it comes from your earlier experiences, particularly when you're feeling, romantic and excited about someone. And I think people make a mistake when they withdraw from physical intimacy, as opposed to try to figure out what's the best way to continue physical intimacy in the face of those stressors. Physical intimacy is one of the unique defining aspects of a marriage. You may have all sorts of people you love, but there's one person you pick and for whom is your sexual partner. So I don't know that they interfere with sex. I think people let them interfere and fail to make adjustments so they can continue to have a romantic and meaningful physical interaction with each other in the face of these things.
That's really an interesting distinction. Anna Marie, what do you think?
Well, I believe that long-term intimate relationships are very much as Ken just mentioned. It really is the fabric upon which we live out the rest of our years together. But I do think that there are many stresses that come in. Some stresses, although you've read a few, I think a lot of what I see in my practice are a lot of people who have self-induced stresses. For many people, they become overweight, and so their body image becomes a barrier to their being comfortable moving forward. and just little things along that way, along that line. So I think it's a very important subject to talk about. I think it's sometimes people are hesitant when they have been together for a long time to ever think about going to a counselor or speaking to a friend, that there might be something in their sexual relationship that is not working the way they had hoped or the way it once did. So I think today's discussion will provide a foundation of hopefully awakening people to it's not something to be concerned about. It's not something to be ashamed about. It's something to be discussed in a very special way.
So if we have two people that have different communication styles in a long-term relationship, how are we sure that there's truly open communication based on trust? Ken?
Well, people have different communication styles, and I mean, some of it has to do, I mean, there are all sorts of reasons. Your upbringing, your family of origin, your just who you are, past experiences. So it's hard to say exactly how to how to resolve that, and for a couple. It's all very individual, and I mean, I have certain standard things that I say about communication styles. About communication, I talk to people about listening being more important than talking. I talk about coming up with an agreement to hear the person out. I talk about expecting to be listened to. I spoke about that in our last presentation. I've got to say, I sort of, as you were asking the question, I was still back a bit on the last question, which
Okay.
a little bit back on Anna Marie's answer. So I'm going to throw a curve here, but I had some comments about when Anna Marie said the thing about body image and feeling comfortable with sex. So I guess my thoughts were a little bit on that.
Well,
Probably
go
should,
ahead, share them.
Yeah, go.
probably should have communicated better and just said it right off the bat, but I delayed that. Uh, you know, the two issues, body image and feeling comfortable. People gain weight. We all do. Lots of us do, not everyone. And people tell me I can't have sex because I don't like the way I look. I feel fat or whatever. And one of the things I say to people is, well, do you look at how you look? I mean, do you look in the mirror? Do you ever just take your clothes off, look at the mirror, and center your attention on your body? And almost always what people will say, what I'll find out is people don't look at themselves. They look at the mirror and they glance away. And as soon as they glance away, they reinforce that they're ugly. So you gained weight. Does that mean you're not attractive to someone? So I talk to people about really staying mindful on your image in the mirror, look at yourself and take in what you look at, as opposed to just assuming before you even absorb it that you don't like the way you look. And then I say, and then do that with your partner. Take your clothes off, be in front of your partner, have your partner look at you. And then there's the other thing, the word comfortable. I mean, my immediate thought is, okay, so you're not comfortable. So what does sex look like when you're uncomfortable? Why do you have to assume that it's always comfortable? Why not come to some agreement or some understanding with your partner? What are we going to do when I feel uncomfortable? As opposed to, we're just not going to do nothing. So anyway, that was just on my mind a little as I was trying to field your last question.
Good. I think that's fantastic. And what I would bring in right along behind that is, in our first podcast, we talked about the definition of a long-term relationship. Okay. And we had said, well, long-term could be a year, could be 6 months, and it could also be 25, 35, 45 years. So I do think the answers that we give today really depend on timing as such. You know, I do. I really think it has. If you've been with someone for 35 years, body image might not come into it as easily. The two of you know one another. I think you are comfortable to a certain degree. But 10, 15 years, 5 years, not so much. Not so much, you know. And it also depends, I would say, on the age of the individuals. If we're talking long term. I think certainly as we mellow into various ages, I think we get a different type of thought pattern and maturity versus when we're still young, and image does play a much different role.
So the thoughts that most people go through their head, regardless if it's a long-term relationship, you're not, you don't have the same appetite for sex. So what do you do?
Well, I think one thing you do is you start with an awareness that when you first got together, you made some decision, there was some consent, there's some agreement that you're going to be intimate partners. And then when you form a long-term commitment, you're operating on an expectation of future consent. You're operating on the expectation that in the future you're going to still agree to have sex, and it's a good assumption. I mean, because after all, you have an expectation you're not going to go elsewhere, so you have a restriction against being someone else, but you also have an expectation of fulfillment, and it's inevitable that as the relationship proceeds and you get away from the initial excitement, that you start to find that your desires and interests differ. I mean, there's some of it can be, not always, but sometimes gender-based, because male and female sexuality is a little different, and we can get into that later. But the point is, you just have to assume it's not even possible to be together years and years and years, and just assume that you're not going to run into differences in your appetites, your desires, the frequency you like, the content, how you like it, what type of tone you want. Is it going to be romantic? I mean, there's just you just don't know what's going to happen, but you do know you're going to be different. And I think you need to accept that, and then come to terms with what's going to work for both of you with your differences, as opposed to assume that you have to be in the same place all the time.
Right. And I would back that up, Ken, with saying that the word trust is a very important word in answering this question. It also brings back, for me, though, the idea of being comfortable. You might trust your partner, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you are comfortable with something that they might want to begin to try, something like that. So I do think the vocabulary that we use with a partner in a long-term relationship about something that we might want to try to spice it up for that particular individual, the tone and the presentation of bringing up what you would like to engage in, I think we have to be very mindful of our partners being comfortable with that newness. And again, I go back to some of the people that I have worked with. For some, the question can come up, why do you want to try something new? Why do you want to try something new? And that can sometimes lead to doubts. Are you not happy with where we are? Or are you happy, or are you seeking something different? So I think conversation, honest, truthful conversation, is very much needed in this particular area. What do you think, Ben?
Well, first of all, the issue, you mentioned the word trust. And I think at whatever point in a relationship people are, say, struggling to figure out, how are they going to make it work at this point? a lot of that will depend on the backdrop. I mean, if it's on the backdrop of a trusting and positive relationship where people basically felt good about each other, it's a lot easier to make that transition than if there has been a history of disappointment and distrust. And, if that's the situation, you do need to look back at that, at what had gone on all that time that that made people not trust each other and not feel good about each other. So those are two different contexts. With regard to the spicing up thing, I know from previous discussions I've talked about, experimentation and sexual repertoire. We've talked separate things here, and I'm a very big believer in experimentation and sexual repertoire, but not in the context of spicing things up. That's not exactly what I'm thinking. What I'm more thinking about is just defining what your options are. And I don't think anyone should ever do something they don't want to do. And I think if someone's willing to try something, they should always also feel free to say, hey, that just doesn't work for me. It more has to do with if there's differences, one may find that there are different ways to approach physical contact under different situations that will then allow both people's needs to be met. But I don't think in terms of that you're trying to spice something up. I think you're just trying to look at what your options are, so that then you can say, hey, someone's in the mood, but someone's not in the mood. What do we do? Under this situation, what do we do? Under that situation, what do we do? What do we do after we've had a hard day at work? What do we do if we have a romantic weekend? The more options you have, the more possibilities you have for then coming to some understandings as a couple with what works for you.
When is the best time to have these conversations? Is it, when you're, well, just when do you have this conversation with your partner, with the kids screaming and the demands that you have to answer that email that keeps on beeping?
Well, definitely not at the dinner table with the kids screaming. I'm going to roll off right off the top. But assuming it's a private discussion between the couple, I mean, you need to communicate. And I think you need to communicate while you're being intimate. You need to communicate at other times. I think that when you're being intimate, it's the worst time to bring in any negativity. Communication of what one likes, what one feels good, positive communication, we're supporting each other. It makes a lot of sense during a sexual act. If there are problematic or more tense things to talk about, then I think it pays to find a separate time, figure out when you're going to talk to each other, and talk to each other, but at a different time.
Anna Marie, do you have?
I would agree with that. I think there has to be an agreement between the two of you. If this is something that you find important, as Ken said a couple of minutes ago, about moving forward with a sexual dialogue, you have to put time aside to do that. And so you do need to carve out a time. If you're going to go out for dinner and have a lovely meal, you don't just run out the door. You take time to get dressed, you take time to so on and so forth. So you set time aside to go and enjoy that environment. And so I think it's important with your partner to do the same thing, to say, all right, let's sit and talk, on Friday night, or just set that time aside. And then I'd also like, Ken, if it's okay, I'd like us to talk about the vocabulary, because it's certainly something that I see often. And words carry a lot of weight, but words mean different things to different people. So I'd love us to talk about that, the vocabulary that we use when we are moving into an area, again, talking about something that we might want to initiate or bring into our relationship with our partner. what type of vocabulary do we use in order to do that?
Well, you may mean a little. I mean, I'd be interested in what you mean by vocabulary, because you may mean more than what I'm responding to right now. But I do know, and I see this in people I've worked with, that people have patterns of communications and ways of talking to each other. There are people I see people who they just almost can't help themselves from being negative and critical to each other, almost as an automatic response. And I do work with people to try to get people to communicate differently and to be more supportive, be more positive, and not just criticizing people. But it's hard for people to change those patterns. So I don't know if that's what you mean, or if you're talking about more specific.
I do. Yeah, I do. I think we have an innate vocabulary that we come into a relationship with, based on, we said this earlier in this particular podcast, based on our own backgrounds, based on what we grew up around and what we were influenced by. So vocabulary to me is a very important place or thing for us to look at. And I think for some people who are not comfortable with sex, sometimes they can get their vocabulary from outside sources that might not foster a respectful relationship. Okay.
Well, and that brings up sort of the gender differences, doesn't it, in how we and what our communication styles are. Would you agree?
I would, yeah.
Okay.
It depends on how, yes, what you grew up in, what type of terminology was used for various body types. Was it derogatory, or was it respectful in whatever way you think respect should be used? I mean, I think all of that is part of it in a long-term relationship.
Well, there's one term that I'd like Ken, for you to describe, because you used it as monogamy. What does that mean today? And
Well, what monogamy means today and what it means for a particular couple are two different things. There's no question that some of the norms have changed. I mean, I know in today's younger generation, and I'm of the older generation, people talk about polyamorous relationships, but when I was, when in the 60s, people talked about swingers, and at other times people went to prostitutes. I mean, the desire for monogamy and difficulty sustaining monogamy have been going on forever, and the forms that it takes differ from time to time. But to me, what I find more difficult for people is that their expectations differ in terms of what is a violation of their covenant of monogamy. They've agreed not to be with someone else, but then does it mean, say you had a past partner that you had been involved with, does that mean you can never talk to that person? Does it mean you can't have a friend of the opposite sex? Does that mean that you can't flirt with somebody, or you can, say, oh, that's a good-looking guy, gal? Does it mean for some people, people that look at pornography, that's a violation of monogamy? For other people, it's not. So monogamy, I think, just in the individual couple, they differ. I know of people that they'll come in and talk in a session about how they went through their partner's cell phone and they saw this text or that text and they weren't sure who it was with. And, and then the question is, well, is that a violation to text somebody of the opposite sex, or is it not? I mean, again, the people come in with an expectation of monogamy, but they don't necessarily clarify for each other what they mean in that particular relationship.
And I think that I agree with Ken 100% in that area, but I think it also happens in a long-term relationship when you first come into the relationship, you might feel secure. But as changes continue, children come in and body change and all of those types of things. So you have different influences coming into the long-term relationship. And then self-image plays a big part. So what might not feel like, I'll use the word cheating, is it cheating looking at your partner's cell phone to see if they are speaking to someone? Is that a lack of integrity? Is, what vocabulary will you use to talk to your partner about those types of things? So I think it is very important for partners to continue a conversation throughout their relationship because it changes. It does. And what you might think when you first get into a relationship, marriage, monogamy, whatever we want to say, does have influences that come in and shift it. So it's, I think, extremely important to continue active conversations.
Are there other words that are easily misinterpreted in these kinds of conversations? I think monogamy was the perfect example, but are there other things that you hear and see often with clients that they're tripping over?
Well, I can just say one of them. I think the word flirting. Flirting, what is flirting? Is it being able to stand next to someone and laugh at their jokes? Is flirting touching someone's arm? What is flirting? Is flirting reciprocating with, a bantering back and forth? I mean, what is flirting? So I think that's something that I have found a lot of couples have. It can become a stumbling block for them. Oh, well, you were flirting with so-and-so. Well, you might both have a different definition of what flirting means. What do you think, Ken? Have you seen it?
Oh, well, absolutely. Someone will, one person will accuse the other one of flirting, and the other will say, will get angry and say, I was just doing this. I was just doing that. I was just talking to the person. And what they haven't come to terms with is, yeah, there may have been nothing wrong with just talking to that person, but you still have to come to terms with the fact that in the other person's point of view, it still feels like you're flirting. And rather than hearing someone and giving credence that this is the way the person feels, people will jump quickly to defend themselves, and in the defense, they feel to hear what it is. I mean, you may still go on and continue to do whatever that person thinks is flirting, but at least if you stop and hear the person and absorb fully, this is how he or she feels when I act this way. At least I get it, that he or she is feeling threatened, they're feeling vulnerable, they're feeling that I'm betraying them. Okay, now you can still decide, well, what are you going to do? But at least you have to hear it. You have to understand that that's
right.
What it is.
I agree, Ken. And I think what you said in the beginning of this podcast, saying that when you work with your clients, talking to them about how do you listen? I think that's so important. How do you listen to someone who says, I think you were flirting tonight when we were out. Why were you flirting? And people become defensive and people become accusatory. So when those two feelings come into the same room, I think what you said earlier is so very important. I think a lot of it comes down to, in my estimation, emotional maturity. If you don't have an emotional, mature partner, again, you can find yourself on a slippery slope. I mean, emotional maturity is a huge part of how to navigate with your partner. And I have quite a number of clients who are in their 40s, late 40s, moving into their 50s, which I find to be just a tough time for a lot of people around that age. And I see, and I don't mean to just zero in on men, but let me just say part of my experience has been that. And some men feel that they might not be as attractive, or let's say looked at. And so that emotional maturity sometimes comes in because they kind of want to go back to that feeling of when they were in their 20s. And, you know, they can have a sense of humor that the rest of the people in the room will laugh with them. And sometimes it moves into trying to impress people. And the partner might be sitting there looking at them and thinking, you know, so all of that. So I think emotional maturity is an extremely important component.
Well, you know, it's interesting. You said there were three things you said there that caught my attention. One of them is about how people want to go back to an earlier stage, and I always encourage people to stay in the moment and to realize, you know, I mean, in your 20s, you were in your 20s, your 30s, you're in your 30s, you know, whatever age you're at, whatever it is always much more peaceful to stay in the moment and to deal with what's now, not what you remember from the past. With regard to emotional maturity, you're absolutely right about that. Except people are who they are. You know, mature people in relationships, immature people in relationships. So hopefully, we want to help people enjoy their relationships, even if they're not very mature. It's two people together, and you're who you are, and you know you have to deal with each other at whatever level you're at. The last thing I was going to say is you're mentioning something like someone saying, well, you know, ask a question. So it says, why were you looking at that girl in that way? And one of the things I always say to people is anytime you say something that sounds like it has a question mark at the end of it, you have to stop and wait for an answer. Because when people say that type of statement, it's almost always accusatory. It's a statement in the form of a question, and the person immediately feels defensive. And I try to encourage people to say, if it sounds like a question, then take a moment and wait for an answer. You know, why did you look at the person that way? You know, maybe they'll say it made me feel good because she seemed attracted to me. Maybe they'll say I didn't realize that it was that I was acting in a way that would hurt your feelings. But whatever it is, if it's a question, stop, get an answer.
That's
And
interesting.
and I was just going to say, do you think it's better to start a statement when you do want to have a conversation about something that you found yourself questioning, or you felt uncomfortable watching, you know, your partner, let's just say, flirt? Do you think, as far as presentation, because in my mind, the way you present something influences the way you are able to talk about it with one another? So you just said the word accusatory. So I think if you walk into a conversation with an accusatory tone, that can lead to a rough conversation, versus saying, when I watched you this evening, I found myself feeling whatever. So really, what in your presentation, you're talking about yourself, you're feeling, you're taking ownership of what you're presenting. How do you feel about that, Ken?
Well, what you're talking about, and I've heard it described on what they call active listening, and I do think there's absolute truth to that. That it's much better to talk about how you felt when someone did something than what they did wrong. You get much farther with that. The other thing is that if you have something that you want to bring up, I would encourage people also to just say, to start it with, as opposed to jumping on someone, to say, listen, I have something important I need to talk to you about. And if people can learn to use that type of opening as a signal to listen, you know, as soon as you say, I have something, something's bothering me. I need to tell you about it. Please listen. And you get an agreement to just hear it. Now, of course, not everybody can do that. It's a model I try to encourage people, but whether or not they can do it it varies.
I would agree.
So tell me, I mean, we talked a lot about communication, but we sort of, there's one question that goes through my mind. You know, we talk about how kids can destroy a marriage or make a marriage. Can sex destroy or make a marriage or a long-term relationship? I shouldn't just limit it to marriages.
Yes, yes. I think that if people, I think there are many situations where people fail to figure out how to conduct to preserve their sexual interaction in over the years, and people they withdraw from each other. Sometimes they go to somebody else. Then someone gets very hurt. Then the whole issue gets focused on the feeling of being hurt as opposed to what each person needed. Yeah, I do think that, I mean, I don't know, what is it, about 50% of all marriages end up in divorce? I think it's more or less that number. And I think a lot of them, the failure to figure out how to retain a romantic relationship with romantic feelings as well as romantic physical interactions. I think failing to figure that out has probably been central in a lot of those relationships ending. Not all of them, but in a lot.
Anna Marie, your thoughts?
Well, I would agree with that. I really would. I do think sex can make or break a relationship, a partnership. And again, I think a lot of outside influences can make that happen. I do. And that's where I often talk to the individuals that come to me about movies and books and songs. And I mean, we're inundated in today's social media frenzy. I mean, our day is so bombarded with messages, and a lot of them, a good number of them, have sexual overtones. So, what messages are you hearing, and what ones kind of start playing in your mind? So, yeah, sometimes we might become dissatisfied with our partner's response to the intimate parts of our sexual partnership. And you might start thinking, well, geez, that's not what I saw in such and such a movie. They seemed to be so. And I mean, so we're looking at something, the more senses we use, the more the message gets across to us. So if we visually see in different movies and hear, all of these different things and hear music, I mean, it does make an influence on us. It does. And so I think that's an important part for us to look at.
Well, and if you consider the movies and the television shows, streaming, if you look at the things that we see where they portray passionate and intimate sex, is almost always at the earliest stages of the relationship. I can't think of many things I've seen lately that portray, senior citizens who have been together for 50 years, in bed together. You don't see that in your typical movie. You don't typically see that imagery of this romantic elder couple or the couple. Well, I'm even thinking, my wife and I just saw Parenthood again with Steve Martin, and I think there's some scene where after they had sex for a while, Steve Martin is getting ready to make love to his wife, and she mentions that Kevin's school wants to have a meeting, and he makes some sort of funny comment. He says, "Oh, I love it when I love it when you talk about school meetings," and they make joke about that. But the point is, you
Right.
really don't see images of just ordinary people, at various stages in the relationship, sustaining their romanticism.
I
That's
agree
not true. That's
100%.
not true, Ken. They always show elderly couples holding hands. That's
Oh
it.
yeah,
That's the
yeah.
romance. That's it.
Well, if there's the Cialis commercials, sure. Then they're really emphasizing that. Yes, but not in a mainstream movie.
Mhm, mhm. And I think also the influence of movies and television shows and music also create an illusion that things should be a certain way. You're supposed to have this type of a response that's euphoric. And some of it's an illusion. I mean, there are different times you can have a magnificent relationship with your partner, but it's like the weather. Sometimes it works and sometimes it's a rainy day. So
And
go ahead, Ken.
no, and you can have a magnificent sexual relationship with your partner without it necessarily being euphoric in the sense of what
I
you've
would
seen
agree. Yeah.
before. I use this analogy where you go to a five-star, Michelin restaurant, you have the best food you ever ate, and then the next morning you get up and have a piece of toast.
Right.
It's like the idea that there are maybe times in your life where you feel euphoric doesn't take away from the value and the intimacy and the closeness that develops by just coupling intimately with another person and feeling good. And maybe it isn't the fireworks that you saw on television or the fireworks that you may have felt at some time, but it
Exactly.
still feels good and it
Right.
feels intimate and it reminds each of you that you are a special couple in this world of 8 billion people.
I
I
agree. And
love
it's
to.
funny, I say that to some of my clients too. I say, what might seem ordinary as time moves on, absolutely becomes extraordinary. And you don't know what ordinary moment might become that extraordinary memory.
So I'd like to end this podcast on the definition of intimacy, because through this whole conversation, we did make reference to sex and communication and different things, but the definition of intimacy in a couple, both couples have to have the same definition. Is that what I'm hearing? For intimacy, and I'm talking about the definition of intimacy.
I would say no. I would say no, they don't have to have the same definition. I think they just have to understand what each other means. One very useful thing around intimacy, uh, I think can be useful for people, for men and women, is if you think that men and women are drawn to sex and men and women are drawn to intimacy, whatever that exactly means, there is a pattern in which, for men, having sex causes them to feel close and intimate. For women, feeling intimate causes them to have more interest in sex. That is a gross generalization. It is not true with everybody. Everyone's an individual, but it's a pattern that can lead to tremendous misunderstanding because if there's the possibility that if the woman is feeling that the man just wants sex, she may feel used, mistreated, and not even understand that this is his conduit into feeling really close and intimate. Whereas the man whose the partner is holding off because she really wants to feel something romantic and intimate, he may feel she's cold and withholding, not even realizing that this is the way she experiences things. So I don't know that you each have to have the same definition. I think you just have to understand where each other is coming from.
I
I
agree.
I think what Ken just said is beautiful. It hits the nail on the head. And I would just go ahead and say, I think for the individual's knowledge of giving what you wish to receive. For me, that's intimacy. So I say that, give what you wish to receive.
Well, I can't thank both of you enough. I really appreciate you joining us today. And thank you.
You are most welcome.